Okay, so you want to be a Somali pirate. You've heard the number 2, 3, sometimes $20 million in ransom for a single ship. You've seen the photos, the imported SUVs bouncing down a dirt road in Puntland, the wedding with 300 guests paid for in cash that didn't exist 6 weeks earlier. You're 22, the fishing fleets that used to feed your town are gone, and a man in Haradheere is telling you that a skiff, a ladder, and 11 days on the open water can make you richer than anyone in your family has ever been. You sign on. Here's the number that wasn't on the recruiting pitch. When that ransom actually clears, the man who climbed the ladder, you, takes home $30,000 to $75,000, split 5 or 6 ways, for a job that can take months and might get you shot. That's under 1% of the figure the news anchor read out loud. That is not a typo. So how does a $2.7 million payday shrink to a few $1,000s in your pocket while a woman 200 miles away who has never seen the ocean collects a return on her investment in you? The answer involves a stock exchange. A real one, with shares and a trading floor. You are not the one holding stock. Today, though, you're just the new guy on the beach at Isle, waiting to be handed a rifle you don't know how to clean. You don't enroll anywhere. There is no academy. There is no licensing exam. No formal apprenticeship, no waiting list. Which sounds like a perk until you understand what it means about your exit options later. The barrier to entry in Somali piracy is not credentials. It is equipment, connections, and a willingness to spend weeks on the open Indian Ocean in a fiberglass skiff with 6 men and an AK-47. The AK-47 is the first cost. On the black market in Puntland, the going rate is roughly $300 to $350. That comes out of your own pocket before the operation begins. If you don't own one, you borrow one from an investor, and the loan is denominated not in dollars but in shares. Your future cut of any ransom shrinks accordingly, before you've even left the beach. This is how the math starts working against you on day 1. The skiff is next. A fast fiberglass hull capable of 25 knots costs somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. You do not buy this. Somebody else buys this, or more precisely, somebody else already owns this, and you are going to be using it in exchange for a piece of what you catch. The engine is separate. Fuel for a 10-day operation runs several $100s more. Neither of those costs come out of the investor's cut. They come out of the crew's cut, itemized against the eventual settlement. Then there is the ladder. This sounds almost absurd, but the ladder is load-bearing in a literal and financial sense. A commercial cargo ship has a freeboard, the distance from the waterline to the deck railing, of 6 to 8 meters on a good day. Grappling hooks and rope, the tools of the 19th century privateer, tend to fail on a moving hull with a crew above you. A lightweight aluminum boarding ladder, or a collapsible hook and pole system, is a specialized piece of equipment. It costs money. It also signals to the investor funding your operation exactly how serious and how competent you are. Because the investor has choices. There are, at peak, dozens of pirate companies competing for funding in Haradheere, and the ones with better equipment get better financing terms. Here is the thing about Haradheere that nobody outside Somalia knows about, or at least nobody outside Somalia knew about until Reuters sent a correspondent there in December 2009 and came back with a story that read like a dispatch from a parallel financial universe. Haradheere, a small coastal town 250 miles northeast of Mogadishu, was by that point home to the world's first piracy-based stock exchange. Not metaphorically. An actual cooperative trading floor, open around the clock, where local civilians could purchase equity stakes in pirate expeditions in exchange for cash, weapons, fuel, food, or skiffs. 72 distinct maritime companies were listed when the story broke. A wealthy former pirate named Mohammed gave Reuters the tour. "The shares are open to all," he said, "and everybody can take part, whether personally at sea or on land, by providing cash, weapons, or useful materials. We've made piracy a community activity." One of the investors interviewed that day was a 22-year-old divorced woman named Sahra Ibrahim. Her initial stake in the enterprise was a rocket-propelled grenade, received as part of her divorce settlement. She had made $75,000 in 38 days. Sahra Ibrahim is not going to sea. Now consider the attrition. Between 2005 and 2011, roughly 1,099 ships were attacked by Somali pirates. Of those, around 218 were successfully hijacked. A success rate that sounds workable until you remember that a failed attack means you spent a week at sea in open water, burned through fuel and provisions that were charged against your future earnings, and came home with nothing, while the investor lost only their equipment costs. In the years after 2011, when international navies flooded the shipping lanes and cargo companies began putting armed guards on deck, the hit rate collapsed. By 2012, attacks were down 75%. By the end of 2013, there had been 0 successful hijackings all year. Not a slowdown. 0. Not a single ship taken. The men on those failed attack skiffs absorbed the losses. The investors just stopped calling. Over 1,300 young Somali men have been jailed in prisons across 21 countries for piracy since 2005. Most received sentences measured not in months, but in decades. The man who became the public face of Somali piracy, Abduwali Muse, the teenager from the 2009 Maersk, Alabama hijacking, the I Am the Captain Now story that became a Tom Hanks film, is currently serving 33 years and 9 months in a federal prison in the United States. He received no ransom. He never received any money. He was on a failed operation that ended with 3 of his crew shot dead by Navy snipers in a lifeboat. His lawyers told the court he was 16 years old and came from terrible conditions, extreme poverty. The judge gave him the maximum. So here is the total cost of entry into Somali piracy: a few $100s for a weapon, a share of the equipment costs that eats into your future earnings before you've earned anything, weeks at sea on a vessel you don't own, working a job with no salary, a washout rate that by the early 2010s was approaching 9 out of 10 attempted operations, and if you are caught by a foreign navy, American, French, Dutch, Indian, a mandatory prosecution in a country you have never visited, for crimes carrying sentences your lawyers will struggle to reduce below 20 years. You are not yet 30 years old. Your first real paycheck is about to arrive. This is where the real education begins. The headline number is $2.7 million. That is the average ransom paid per ship over the peak years of Somali piracy, according to the World Bank, UNODC, and Interpol's joint report. It is the number that gets quoted in the news. It is the number the TV presenter reads over footage of a luxury 4x4 roaring through a Puntland dust cloud. It is not your number. It is not remotely close to your number. And understanding why requires understanding exactly how the money moves before it reaches you. First, the mechanics of how the ransom is actually earned. This is not a salary. There is no base pay, no hourly rate, no overtime. You don't get paid for the weeks at sea before the target appears. You don't get paid for the fuel burned running down a ship that turns out to be moving too fast to board. You don't get paid for the first 3 days on a hijacked vessel, while the negotiator in a hotel room somewhere figures out who actually owns the cargo. You get a percentage of whatever the negotiator eventually extracts, paid once, when the deal closes. The deal closing can take 3 to 5 months. During those months, you are sitting on a ship anchored off the Somali coast, guarding hostages in the heat, waiting, eating food, and chewing khat that is being provided on credit against your eventual payout. The khat is a real line item. Pirates stationed aboard hijacked vessels chew it daily. It's both a stimulant that keeps you awake through long guard shifts and a social currency among the crew. It arrives by skiff each afternoon. The cost accrues against the operation's expenses and is ultimately subtracted from the crew's collective share. A senior pirate quoted by Al Jazeera after the release of the Ukrainian arms ship MV Faina in 2009 put it plainly. There was a time we thought of releasing the ship without any payment on humanitarian grounds. But we spent a lot of borrowed money on khat, cigarettes, cola, mineral water, and food. He was not exaggerating. The borrowed part is real. The food and supplies are fronted by local merchants and settled out of the ransom, before the crew sees anything. Now layer in the structural cut. In the 11-page handwritten piracy contract found by the Seychelles Coast Guard inside a seized pirate skiff, a real document, with real terms, outlining bonuses and penalties in specific language. The division of proceeds was explicit. Investors who provided weapons, fuel, skiffs, or the mothership received shares considerably larger than those allocated to the men at sea. According to former Australian police officer Wayne Miller, who analyzed the contract while training Seychelles interrogators, whatever monies were made, the bulk would come back to them. The negotiator, the person who never boards the ship, never fires a weapon, never spends a night at sea, typically received the largest individual share of all. Then comes the top of the pyramid. According to the World Bank report, between 30 and 75% of the total ransom went to the financiers, the kingpins, who organized multiple operations simultaneously, placed investors, managed relationships with local government officials, and never appeared anywhere near the water. The foot soldiers, received a standard fee of $30,000 to $75,000 per ship. That standard fee sounds like a fixed salary until you realize it is the gross number before the cot debt, before the weapon loan, before the equipment fees, before the guard's share, before Al-Shabaab's cut of operations running through certain ports. By the time the accounting is done, the World Bank report notes that pirates' actual take was frequently less than 0.1% of the ransom, below the already thin stated share. Now run an honest month. Your operation takes 5 months from launch to ransom payment. During those 5 months, you spent roughly 3 weeks at sea before the boarding, unpaid, followed by 4 months aboard the hijacked vessel waiting for negotiations to close. Call the total working time 150 days. The ransom closes at $2.7 million. Your crew's collective share after investors and the negotiator is 15%, call it $400,000. Divided among 6 men, that's roughly $67,000 each. Subtract the cot and provisions credit accumulated over 4 months. Subtract the AK-47 loan. Subtract the fuel cost allocated to the crew. Real net, somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. Divide by 150 days, or 1,800 hours of actual time committed to this operation. You are making between $17 and $28 per hour before subtracting the capital costs you absorbed. The Somali average annual wage during the peak piracy years was approximately $550. A single successful operation pays 54 times that. This is the only reason the math makes sense. Relative to the alternative, which is subsistence fishing in waters stripped by illegal foreign trawlers, or driving cot deliveries for $700 a day that mostly goes to vehicle maintenance, the $50,000 gross is a generational event. But relative to the $2.7 million that shipped out of the insurer's office, it is a rounding error. The gap between those two numbers is someone else's business model, and the someone else is not going to see. A negotiator makes more than you. An investor makes more than you. A cot merchant supplying your floating prison makes more than you. The British maritime insurance industry, which collects premiums on ships transiting high-risk waters and pays a fraction of that in ransoms, made more from Somali piracy than the pirates did, according to some analysts. The ransom is the smallest part of the supply chain you created. There is something else, something that doesn't appear on a settlement sheet but has a real price. The waiting breaks people. Hostage negotiations during peak piracy averaged months. The Indian crew of one vessel documented 332 days of captivity. The Cambodian crew of another sat aboard for over a year. The pirates guarding them sit on the same ship for the same period. Armed, bored, burning through cod on credit, unable to leave, unable to know when it ends. One pirate explained to an Indian hostage that he'd worked for the government and received only food and cot as payment. Working as a pirate, I got money, food, cot, and cigarettes, and I married 3 wives, he said. Piracy good mustakbil. Mustakbil means future. What he didn't say, what the math will eventually say for him, is that the future he was describing had an expiration date already baked in. Something does the breaking that the numbers miss. The name of it will come later. Every Somali pirate's career contains a trap. Not a mistake, not a run of bad luck. A machine, built into the structure of the enterprise itself, that operates predictably, that the people running the machine understand and rely upon. and that tightens in a specific sequence over time. Here is how it works. You bring equipment to your first operation, your AK-47, maybe your family's fishing skiff, and in exchange you receive a share slightly larger than the pure foot soldiers. This is rational. You assumed capital risk. But the equipment is now part of the operation's inventory, which is managed by the financier. The financier's accounting is not audited by anyone. There are no external books. The only record of what was contributed and what was promised is the handwritten contract in the skiff. And if the skiff is captured, that contract is gone. The foot soldier who contributed capital has no recourse if the split is wrong. He can accept the number he's given, or he can refuse and not work again. In an economy with no other work. Year 1. You tell yourself it's temporary. The money from the first operation is good. Relative to $550 a year, it is extraordinary. You spend some of it on the things everyone spends it on. Imported cars, new construction, the wedding. These are public demonstrations of success in a community with limited public goods, and they are rational given the uncertainty of future earnings. But they also liquidate your capital. You are not building savings. You are converting a one-time payment into status goods, with no resale value in a local market. Year 2, you need another operation. The financier knows this. Your leverage was highest before the first job. Now he knows your financial position, your skills, and your hunger. The terms shift slightly. Nothing dramatic, just slightly fewer shares per contribution, slightly higher charges for the khat and provisions credit. You accept, because the alternative is $550 a year. Year 3, the math becomes clear. You are not accumulating capital. You are cycling through operations, each one consuming months of your time, each one producing a payout that disappears faster than it arrived, each one leaving you more dependent on the next operation's financier, because you have fewer assets to bring to the table and fewer options outside the enterprise. The skills you have developed, navigation, vessel boarding, negotiation of controlled environments, are not transferable to the legal economy. You cannot walk into Mogadishu with a resume that reads, Armed Maritime Operations. You cannot open a bank account with ransom money, at least not easily, because the money launderers who can place it take their own cut. You are specialized in an industry with no legal off-ramp, in which your leverage decreases the longer you stay. This is who profits. The financier who funds the operation keeps 30 to 75% of the ransom. He does not age in the ocean. He does not accumulate a criminal record in 21 countries. He reinvests his proceeds into the khat trade, into real estate, into the next operation. The World Bank traced Somali piracy proceeds into legitimate businesses in Djibouti, Kenya, the UAE, and the United Kingdom. The kingpin's name appears nowhere on the boat. He is the man with the stock exchange. Follow the money one level higher, and you reach the absurdity that makes the whole system legible. The global cost of Somali piracy at its 2011 peak was estimated at $7 billion annually. The total ransom paid in that same year was $160 million. The gap, nearly $6.9 billion, was absorbed by the shipping and insurance industries through rerouted trade lanes, higher premiums, armed guard contracts, and naval patrol costs. The British maritime insurance market, headquartered in the City of London, processed enormous premium increases on ships transiting high-risk waters, collected those premiums from global shipping companies, and paid ransoms that were a small fraction of the total intake. Some analysts concluded that London's financial sector profited more from Somali piracy than the pirates did. The pirates created the risk premium. They did not collect it. Then came the day the machine made itself visible. October 12, 2013. Zaventem Airport, Brussels. Mohammed Abdi Hassan, known across East Africa as Afwain, Big Mouth, stepped off a flight from Nairobi, believing he was about to sign a contract to serve as a technical advisor on a documentary film about his life as a pirate kingpin. Belgian federal police were waiting at the gate. The film was a sting. Belgian investigators had spent months cultivating a relationship with Afwain's associate, the former governor of the Himan and Heb region, gradually building enough trust to persuade the man responsible for dozens of hijackings, including the 2008 seizure of the Saudi supertanker Sirius Star and the Ukrainian arms ship MV Faina that a Western film crew wanted to celebrate his career. He flew to Belgium to sign the contract. He was convicted of piracy and kidnapping and sentenced to 20 years. He was the first pirate kingpin ever prosecuted by the international community. The foot soldiers? The men who actually boarded the ships? Over 1,000 of them had already been jailed in countries from Kenya to the Netherlands. They went first because they were the ones on the water. The man who took 75% of the ransoms from his hotel room managed to stay out of frame for 8 years. Afwain was not an exception to the system. He was the system, operating exactly as designed. And his arrest didn't happen because the system broke down. It happened because Belgian police spent months running a reverse Argo operation that was, in its own way, a more elegant con than anything Afwain had ever pulled at sea. Your version of this story is already scheduled. The only question that actually matters is whether the whole thing adds up. Time to run that math. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. Does being a Somali pirate actually pay? The median career of a Somali foot soldier pirate ran roughly 3 to 5 years during the peak period, 2005 to 2012. In that window, a reasonably active pirate might complete 3 to 5 successful operations. Given that operations ran months long and successful hijackings were always a minority of attempts. At $30,000 to $50,000 net per successful operation, the median career gross is somewhere between $90,000 and $250,000 before the spending that liquidates it. Against a baseline alternative of $550,000 to $3,000 a year in formal income, even the low end of that range represents a significant economic event. The lifetime net, factoring in the periods between operations where income is zero and spending continues, lands between $60,000 and $150,000 over the career, enough to build a house in Puntland, fund a small business, or give a family a decade of stability. Measured by Somali standards, it is meaningful money. Measured by the number on the ransom wire, it is a statistical trace. The winning path exists. The investors, the negotiators, the kingpins who organized multiple simultaneous operations and never boarded a ship, these people made real money. Afwain's network generated hundreds of millions in ransom over 8 years. His personal share of that, even at conservative estimates, was in the tens of millions. He owned businesses. He owned real estate. He acquired the kind of diversified asset base that survives a market downturn. He was the 1% of the 1% of the operation, and roughly 1 in 100 pirates ever reached that level. For the foot soldier who made it to financier, who parlayed 2 or 3 successful operations into investor capital before the naval blockade closed the window, the returns were genuinely extraordinary. The odds of reaching that level were comparable to the odds of a first-round NFL draft pick making it to a second contract. Possible, documented, and not a reasonable planning assumption for the other 99 men on the beach. The exit value is close to nothing. The skills developed in Somali piracy, vessel identification, boarding tactics, hostage management, navigating the Indian Ocean by instrument, are not licensed anywhere, not credentialed anywhere, and not legally useful anywhere outside the enterprise. There is no maritime security contractor who will hire you on the strength of having boarded a supertanker at gunpoint. There is no government transfer to pension. There is no union. The years invested in the career do not compound into anything portable. When the industry collapsed in 2012, when armed guards on cargo ships produced a 100% success rate against boarding attempts and financiers stopped funding expeditions, the foot soldiers did not pivot into adjacent roles. They went back to the beach. The ale piracy economy, which had briefly brought luxury cars and construction money into a town of 20,000 people, collapsed. By 2015, the houses were emptying again. Here is the honest ledger. What this life genuinely gives, that a spreadsheet misses. The only economic agency available to young men in a coastal region with no functioning state, no solvent fishing industry, and no labor market. A sense of directional power in a situation defined by powerlessness. Real money, at least once, that in a Somali context represents something generational. A house, a wedding, a mother who doesn't go hungry. The ledger's other side, what the recruiters never mention, a career with no arc, in which your leverage decreases over time rather than increasing, a body subjected to months of open ocean exposure, poor nutrition, and the specific physiological toll of sustained alertness on stimulants, a criminal record circulating in the databases of 21 nations that forecloses legal migration, legal employment, and legal financial services for life, and, in roughly